The morning sun cast long shadows across Denver International Airport's vast terminal as Michelle Chen wheeled her carry-on through the sliding doors. She had done this walk countless times before. The same polished floors, the same buzzing atmosphere, the same mix of excited tourists and hurried business travelers. But today was different. Today, she was walking in as Bluesky Airlines' new senior legal advisor. The promotion had come after 15 years of hard work, countless late nights poring over aviation regulations, and more coffee than she cared to remember. Her mom had cried when she called to share the news, remembering their family's humble beginnings and the sacrifices they'd made for her education. Michelle adjusted her navy blazer and checked her watch. Still plenty of time before her flight to New York. The board meeting wasn't until tomorrow morning, but she always liked to arrive early, get settled, and review her notes one final time. That's just who she was. Thorough, prepared, professional. The terminal was bustling with its usual morning energy. A young family struggled with an overflowing stroller. A group of college students laughed over their coffee cups, and business people power walked past, foams pressed to their ears. Michelle smiled, remembering her own first flights as a junior attorney, nervous and clutching her briefcase like a shield. She pulled out her phone to check her emails while waiting in the check-in line. The CEO had sent over some last-minute agenda items for tomorrow's meeting. Major policy changes were coming, and she was going to be at the heart of it all. Her fingers scrolled through the detailed notes she'd prepared, each point carefully considered and researched. "Next in line, please," a voice called out. Michelle looked up from her phone and rolled her suitcase forward. The morning light streaming through the huge terminal windows caught the golden wings pin on her lapel. A graduation gift from her mentor when she passed the bar exam. "You're going to soar," he had told her. And she had. She reached for her corporate ID and travel documents, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The documents were pristine. She double-checked everything last night, just as she always did. 15 years of corporate law had taught her the importance of having every detail in place. "Good morning," she said warmly to the gate agent, extending her documents. "Flight 2187 to New York, please." She couldn't have known then that this routine business trip was about to become anything but routine. That her years of experience, her Harvard law degree, and her new position were about to be put to an unexpected test. That the next hour would challenge not just her professional composure, but everything she believed about how far we've come as a society. The gate agent's expression shifted as he took her documents, and Michelle felt the first tiny prickle of unease. It was subtle, just a slight narrowing of the eyes, a small tightening of the lips. But she'd spent years reading people across negotiating tables. Something wasn't right. Later, she would look back on this moment, this last peaceful moment before everything changed, and realize that sometimes the biggest challenges come when you least expect them. And sometimes the most important changes start with a single moment of injustice. But for now, she just stood there, her boarding pass ready, her mind already on tomorrow's meeting, unaware that she was about to become the center of a story that would reshape airline policy and challenge deep-seated prejudices in corporate America. The gate agent held Michelle's corporate ID card up to the light, turning it this way and that. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were examining a rare artifact rather than a standard company credential. Michelle felt her heart rate quicken slightly, though her face remained perfectly composed, a skill honed through countless courtroom appearances. "Is there a problem?" she asked quietly, conscious of the growing line behind her. The agent's response was to wave over his supervisor without even looking at her. The supervisor, a man with graying temples and a permanent frown, approached with the kind of authority that came from years of making quick judgments. "Ma'am, there seems to be some irregularity with your documentation," the supervisor said, his voice carrying just enough to draw curious glances from nearby passengers. Michelle noticed a businessman in line behind her craned his neck to see what was happening, then quickly look away when she caught his eye. Irregularity? Michelle repeated, her lawyer's mind already cataloging every word, every gesture. Could you please be specific about what irregularity you're referring to? Her voice was steady, professional, the same tone she used when questioning witnesses in depositions. The supervisor pointed to her corporate ID. This claims you're the senior legal advisor for Bluesky Airlines. These positions are typically... He paused, choosing his words carefully, though his meaning hung in the air unspoken. We just need to verify some things. Michelle felt a familiar weight settle in her stomach. She'd been here before, not at this airport, not in this exact situation, but in this moment of having to prove herself beyond what others would need to do. She thought of the framed Harvard diploma in her office, the countless cases she'd won, the 15 years she'd spent building her career. None of that mattered right now. Of course, she said, reaching for her phone. I'd be happy to provide additional verification. Would you like me to call the corporate office? But the supervisor was already shaking his head, speaking into his radio. Michelle caught fragments of words. Suspicious documentation. Possible fraudulent credentials. Other passengers were openly staring now. A mother pulled her curious child closer, as if fraud were contagious. Two teenage girls whispered behind their hands, their phones partially raised. Michelle stood perfectly still, her spine straight, her expression neutral. She'd learned long ago that in moments like these, composure was both armor and weapon. The gate agent was now pulling up something on his computer, his fingers tapping with exaggerated importance. Ma'am, attempting to use fraudulent corporate credentials is a serious offense, he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who felt suddenly important. Michelle took a deep breath, thinking of her mother's words from years ago. Sometimes you have to be twice as good to get half as far. Right now, she needed to be exponentially better just to board a plane she had every right to be on. I understand the seriousness, she replied, her voice clear and measured. Which is why I suggest you consider very carefully what actions you're taking right now. It wasn't a threat. Michelle never threatened. It was a professional courtesy, a gentle reminder that actions have consequences. The overhead speakers announced another flight's departure, the cheerful voice a stark contrast to the tension at the check-in counter. Michelle could feel her phone buzzing in her bag, probably the New York office wondering where she was. The irony wasn't lost on her. Somewhere in that building, her name was on legal documents that helped keep this very airline running. As security approached, Michelle straightened her blazer, a small gesture of self-possession in a situation spinning beyond her control. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought in courtrooms with dramatic speeches, but in quiet moments like these, with dignity as the only weapon at hand. Two airport security officers approached the check-in counter, their boots clicking against the polished floor. Michelle noted how other passengers parted to let them through, like waves around the stone. She remained still, one hand resting lightly on her carry-on handle, the other holding her phone, now recording quietly by her side. Can you step over here, ma'am? The taller officer gestured toward a less crowded area near the wall. His nameplate read, Officer Wilson. Michelle made a mental note, just as she did in every legal proceeding. Details mattered. I'll stay right here, thank you, she replied calmly. Unless I'm being officially detained, I prefer to conduct this conversation in view of the security cameras. She glanced meaningfully at the black dome above them. 15 years of corporate law had taught her the value of documented interactions. The supervisor's face reddened slightly. Ma'am, we have a responsibility to investigate suspicious documentation. It's standard procedure. He emphasized the last two words as if they could shield him from what they all knew was happening. Michelle looked around the terminal. A white businessman walked past, his corporate ID swinging freely from his neck. Nobody stopped him. An older man in a golf shirt checked in without a second glance. She was the only one being questioned, the only one surrounded by security. Standard procedure, Michelle repeated softly. Interesting. I'd love to see the written policy on what makes documentation suspicious. She pulled out her bar association card and her state ID. Perhaps these will help clarify things. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, pretending not to watch. A young woman in a college sweatshirt caught Michelle's eye and gave her a tiny nod of support. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it meant everything. The shorter officer reached for her documents, but Michelle kept them firmly in hand. "I'll hold them while you examine them," she said. Another lesson learned long ago. Never let go of your identification in situations like these. "Look," the supervisor cut in, his patience wearing thin. "If you can't cooperate, we'll have to." "Have to what?" Michelle's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of countless courtroom victories. "Deny me boarding. Detain me? Please, finish that sentence. I'm genuinely curious about what you believe your legal options are in this situation." Her phone buzzed again. The New York office would be wondering where their senior legal advisor was. The irony of the situation would have been amusing if it weren't so frustrating. Somewhere in this very building, there were contracts she had reviewed, legal documents bearing her signature. A young gate agent who hadn't been involved watched from behind her computer, her eyes wide. Michelle made eye contact with her, seeing not judgment but uncertainty. This, Michelle thought, was how change began, with people witnessing what was wrong and questioning what they always accepted as right. "We're just doing our jobs," Officer Wilson said, but there was a new note of uncertainty in his voice. Perhaps he was starting to realize that this situation wasn't going to play out the way these situations usually did. "I understand," Michelle replied, "and I'm doing mine, part of which involves understanding exactly how and why this interaction escalated to involve security." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "Would you like me to wait while you contact corporate headquarters? I believe they'll be very interested in this interpretation of standard procedure." The supervisor shifted uncomfortably, looking from the security officers to Michelle and back again. The power dynamic was shifting, subtle but sure as a changing tide. In the background, the airport continued its usual symphony of announcements, rolling luggage, and hurried footsteps, but right here, in this small circle of space, something important was happening. Michelle checked her watch. 20 minutes had passed since this began. 20 minutes of having to prove she belonged in a space she had every right to occupy. 20 minutes that would soon become a catalyst for change, though none of them knew it yet. Michelle took out her laptop with deliberate slowness, placing it on the nearby counter. The security officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure about this unexpected development. She opened her email client, then looked directly at the supervisor. "I'm going to need your full name and employee ID number," she said, fingers hovering over the keyboard. For accuracy purposes, her voice carried the same professional tone she used in boardroom meetings, neither aggressive nor apologetic. The supervisor crossed his arms. "Ma'am, that's not necessary. We're trying to resolve a security concern. And I'm documenting that resolution process," Michelle interrupted smoothly. "As is my right. Now, your name and ID number, please." She glanced at his badge. "Mr. Thompson, is it? I can make out your first name. Starts with a P." A flicker of unease crossed his face. The dynamic was shifting. She was no longer just a passenger being questioned, but someone taking detailed notes. Someone who knew procedure. Someone who understood systems and how they worked. "I'm also noting the time," she continued, her fingers moving across the keyboard. "It's been exactly 27 minutes since you first questioned the authenticity of my corporate credentials. I'm particularly interested in understanding the specific criteria used to flag these documents as suspicious." The young gate agent who had been watching nervously spoke up. I don't think we actually have written criteria for that." Her voice was quiet but clear. The supervisor shot her a sharp look, but Michelle gave her an encouraging nod. "Thank you for that clarification," Michelle said, typing. That's very helpful information. She turned back to the supervisor. Would you agree with that statement, Mr. Thompson? That there are no written criteria? The silence that followed was heavy with realization. In the background, a flight to Chicago was announced, life going on as normal, while this small drama played out by the check-in counter. Michelle pulled up another document on her laptop, the airline's own employee handbook. I find it interesting because according to Section 4.3 of the Corporate Policy Manual, all security procedures must have clear, documented guidelines to prevent arbitrary enforcement. She turned the screen slightly, allowing them to see the official document. Officer Wilson shifted his weight uncomfortably. Ma'am, we're just trying to protect the airline. I appreciate that. Michelle's voice softened slightly. That's actually my job, too. Which is why I'm concerned about what's happening right now. She gestured to her phone, still recording. Every minute of this interaction represents potential liability for the company. Not to mention the reputational damage if this becomes public. A new wave of passengers flowed past them, some slowing to watch the scene. Michelle noticed a few pulling out their phones, probably wondering if this was something they should be recording. The irony wasn't lost on her. They saw drama unfolding but missed the quiet revolution happening in plain sight. I'm going to make this simple, Michelle said, closing her laptop. You have 3 options. 1. You can continue this unnecessary investigation, and I'll include every detail in my report to the board tomorrow. 2. You can escalate this to your regional manager. I have their number right here. Or 3, she paused, giving them room to find a graceful exit. We can acknowledge that an error in judgment was made and move forward constructively. The weight of her words hung in the air. This wasn't just about catching a flight anymore. It was about standing up to systemic problems in a way that created change rather than conflict. Michelle had spent her career building things up, not tearing them down, and even now, faced with blatant prejudice, she was offering a path forward. Her phone buzzed again, probably another message from New York. But for now, Michelle kept her eyes on the supervisor, watching him process the choice in front of him. Sometimes, the most powerful resistance wasn't about winning a fight, but about forcing others to confront their own assumptions in ways they couldn't ignore. The tense standoff was interrupted by Michelle's phone ringing. Not buzzing this time, but actually ringing. The sound cut through the awkward silence like a knife. Michelle glanced at the screen and allowed herself a small smile. The caller ID read, CEO Office, Bluesky Airlines. If you'll excuse me, she said politely, I should take this. She answered the phone, putting it on speaker without warning. The supervisor's eyes widened as he realized what she was doing. Michelle, where are you? A crisp, authoritative voice filled the air around the check-in counter. The pre-board meeting was supposed to start 5 minutes ago. We've got the entire executive team waiting on our new senior legal advisor's input on the merger documentation. The color drained from the supervisor's face. The young gate agent's mouth formed a perfect O of surprise. Officer Wilson took an unconscious step backward. I apologize for the delay, Mr. Richards, Michelle replied, her voice perfectly steady. I'm actually still at the Denver airport. There seems to be some confusion about my credentials. She paused, letting the word confusion hang in the air. The staff here is having trouble believing I'm really Bluesky's senior legal advisor. There was a moment of dead silence on the other end of the line. When the CEO's voice returned, it had a dangerous edge to it. You're telling me our own airport staff is preventing our head of legal affairs from boarding our own airline? The supervisor was now frantically pulling up something on his computer, his fingers trembling slightly on the keyboard. The young gate agent had backed away entirely, trying to make herself invisible behind her monitor. That's correct, Michelle confirmed. They've had security detain me for nearly 40 minutes now, suggesting my corporate ID might be fraudulent. Her tone remained professional, but she emphasized the word fraudulent just enough to make the supervisor wince. Put the supervisor on, the CEO demanded. Michelle held out the phone. The supervisor looked at it like it might bite him, then slowly took it. "This is Supervisor Thompson, sir." His voice cracked slightly on the "sir." What followed was a one-sided conversation consisting mostly of "yes, sir," and "no, sir," from the supervisor, whose face grew increasingly pale with each passing second. The gathered crowd of onlookers had grown larger, sensing that something significant was unfolding. When the supervisor handed the phone back to Michelle, his hand was shaking slightly. There seems to have been a misunderstanding," he stammered. "Michelle," the CEO's voice came through the speaker again. "I'm sending an email right now to HR about this incident. Would you mind handling the legal review of any resulting policy changes when you get here?" "Of course," Michelle replied, allowing herself the smallest hint of satisfaction. "That's what you hired me for after all." The security officers had already begun to retreat, their earlier authority deflated like a punctured balloon. The supervisor was now frantically printing out a boarding pass, his earlier suspicion replaced by obvious panic. "I'll see you in New York," Michelle said into the phone, ending the call. She turned to the supervisor, who was now holding out her boarding pass like a peace offering. "Thank you," she said, taking it with the same professional courtesy she'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. "And I'll be sure to give this incident my full attention during tomorrow's policy review." As she walked toward the security checkpoint, Michelle heard the whispered conversations behind her, saw the looks of admiration from some passengers who had witnessed the whole thing. But she didn't stop. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful statement you could make was simply continuing forward, head held high. The young gate agent caught her eye as she passed, and Michelle gave her a small nod. Maybe this incident would teach the next generation of airline staff a valuable lesson about assumptions and prejudice. Sometimes the best way to change a system wasn't to break it, but to become an integral part of it, then reshape it from within. 2 weeks after the incident, Michelle sat in her corner office in New York, reviewing the final draft of Bluesfee's new training protocols. The view of the city skyline stretched out behind her, but her attention was focused on the document before her. This wasn't just another corporate policy, it was personal. "The new training program looks impressive," said Lisa from HR, who sat across from her desk. "But do you really think we can change deeply rooted behaviors with a training module?" Michelle looked up from the papers and smiled. "This isn't just another sensitivity training video that employees can click through while checking their phones." She turned her computer screen to show Lisa the detailed program she'd developed. The presentation outlined real-world scenarios, including body camera footage from actual airport interactions. Michelle had spent hours interviewing staff at all levels, from baggage handlers to senior management, gathering their perspectives and experiences. "See this section." She pointed to a particular slide. "We're not just telling them what not to do. We're showing them how unconscious biases affect decision-making in high-pressure situations. And more importantly," she flipped to the next slide, "we're giving them practical tools to handle these situations better." The young gate agent from Denver, the one who had spoken up about the lack of written criteria, had actually helped develop part of the training. Michelle had reached out to her the day after the incident, not to punish, but to learn and collaborate. "What about Supervisor Thompson?" Lisa asked carefully. The board was pushing for immediate termination. Michelle shook her head. Firing him wouldn't solve the underlying problem. Instead, she pulled up another document. "He's agreed to be part of our pilot program. He's sharing his story with new employees, explaining how unconscious bias affected his judgment that day." The door opened and one of the board members poked his head in. "Michelle, do you have a minute? The pilots union wants to incorporate some of your training materials into their procedures." "Of course," Michelle replied, standing up. This was the kind of ripple effect she'd hoped for. Change spreading through the organization organically, department by department. Later that afternoon, Michelle watched from the boardroom window as a Bluesky plane took off, its wings catching the sunlight. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. Saw the article about your new training program. So proud of you, honey. The article had appeared in the morning's business section. Major airline revolutionizes staff training after incident. They'd wanted to interview her, but Michelle had declined. This wasn't about personal recognition. It was about systemic change. She walked back to her desk, passing the wall where the company's new value statement hung. She'd helped write it, ensuring that words like respect and inclusion weren't just corporate buzzwords, but commitments backed by concrete actions and accountability measures. A notification popped up on her computer. The first round of training feedback was in. As she scrolled through the responses, she saw comments that made her smile. Never realized how many decisions we make based on unconscious assumptions. The role-playing scenarios really opened my eyes. Finally, training that feels relevant to our daily work. The phone on her desk rang. Another department head wanting to discuss implementing the new protocols. This was how real change happened, she thought as she reached for the phone. Not through grand gestures or harsh punishments, but through persistent, thoughtful action that transformed an organization from the inside out. On her desk sat her corporate ID, the same one that had been questioned that day in Denver. Now it was a reminder that sometimes the best response to prejudice wasn't anger, but action. Sometimes the most powerful way to fight systemic problems was to become part of the system and change it, one policy, one person, one day at a time. 1 year had passed since that morning at Denver International Airport. Michelle stood in the same terminal, but this time she wasn't alone. Behind her, a group of airline executives from across the country gathered for the unveiling of Bluesky's new training center. Hard to believe it's been a year, said the young gate agent who had spoken up that day. She was now the lead trainer for the customer service department, her honesty that day having marked her as someone who could help drive real change. Michelle watched as airport staff hurried past the new digital displays that lined the terminal walls. Instead of just showing flight times, they now rotated through messages about inclusion and professionalism. Respect takes flight here, one read, followed by clear guidelines for both staff and passengers. The numbers speak for themselves, Michelle said, holding up the latest quarterly report. Customer complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped by 78%. Employee satisfaction scores were at an all-time high. Other airlines had started reaching out, wanting to know how Bluesky had transformed its culture so dramatically. The CEO stepped up to the podium for the ceremony. A year ago, an incident in this very terminal could have become a PR nightmare. Instead, it became the catalyst for the most significant positive change in our company's history. Michelle thought back to that morning, remembering the fear and frustration she'd felt. Now, standing here, she saw something different. The same security officers who had confronted her were now helping train their colleagues on proper protocol. Supervisor Thompson had become one of the program's strongest advocates, his personal story of learning and growth touching more lives than any punishment could have. Our new training center isn't just about avoiding mistakes, the CEO continued. It's about building a culture where every employee feels empowered to do what's right, and every passenger knows they'll be treated with dignity and respect. A group of new hires toured the facility, their eyes wide as they took in the state-of-the-art simulation rooms where staff could practice handling difficult situations. The walls displayed real success stories, examples of employees who had stood up against bias or found creative ways to make passengers feel welcome. Michelle's phone buzzed with a message. Another airline wanted to implement similar changes. Her inbox was full of speaking requests, but she preferred to stay focused on the work itself. The real victory wasn't in recognition. It was in watching change happen, person by person, day by day. After the ceremony, she walked through the terminal, stopping to chat with staff members she recognized. A flight attendant shared how the new training had helped her handle a difficult situation last week. A baggage handler proudly showed off his completion certificate from the Advanced Cultural Awareness course. Near the same check-in counter where it all began, Michelle paused. A new sign hung there. We're committed to treating every passenger with respect and professionalism. If we fall short of this commitment, please let us know. As she headed toward her gate, Michelle overheard a supervisor training a new employee. Remember, the supervisor was saying, "Our job isn't just to check documents. It's to make every passenger feel welcome and respected." On the wall behind them hung a plaque commemorating the launch of Bluesky's Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. It didn't mention Michelle by name. That had been her choice. Instead, it simply read, "Change begins with one person standing up for what's right. It continues when we all work together to make that change last." Boarding her flight, Michelle smiled at the crew. The flight attendant checking boarding passes wore a small pin that read, "Trained in Inclusive Service Excellence." Another outcome of the past year's work. As she settled into her seat, Michelle opened her laptop to review the latest proposal. There was still work to be done, more changes to make, more people to reach. But looking out the window at the airport where it all began, she knew that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of resistance. And sometimes the most powerful legacy isn't in what you change, but in empowering others to become agents of change themselves.